The ground organization at airfields serving the airlift demonstrated the inadequacy of preparation. Airfields lacked sufficient space for aircraft, forcing them to park wingtip to wingtip. Refueling equipment was insufficient, causing delays. Loading operations were slow and inefficient, conducted manually by soldiers carrying supplies to aircraft. Even worse, the supplies delivered often did not match the Sixth Army's needs. Aircraft carried summer uniforms when winter clothing was desperately needed, luxury goods instead of food, and ammunition for weapons no longer in use. The evacuation of wounded soldiers created scenes that traumatized air crews. Aircraft landing in the pocket were surrounded by desperate men pleading for evacuation. Crew chiefs had to choose who would leave and who would be left behind. Many were forced to push wounded soldiers away as aircraft took off, unable to carry them due to weight limits. The Potomac and Gumrack airfields deteriorated rapidly under bombardment and overuse. Runways were cratered by artillery, fuel supplies were destroyed, and maintenance facilities collapsed. Each failure reduced the already limited capacity of the airlift. General Wolfgang Pickert, commanding Luftwaffe forces inside the pocket, reported that supplies were wholly inadequate. Soldiers were starving, ammunition was limited, medical supplies were exhausted. These reports reached Göring, but did not change his stance. Transport pilots quickly realized they were flying impossible missions. Major Gerhard Baumbach recorded mounting losses, declining deliveries, and worsening conditions. His reports warned that the mission was failing, but operations continued. By December, Luftwaffe headquarters received clear statistical evidence of failure. Deliveries averaged far below requirements, aircraft losses mounted, weather and enemy action made success impossible. Yet Göring continued to promise success and demand greater effort. As evidence mounted, Göring withdrew from direct oversight. He delegated decisions, avoided operational details, and retreated into denial. Reports showed deliveries dropping into the 60 to 70-ton range. Aircraft availability declined weekly. Sixth Army soldiers weakened from starvation. Hitler's demands worsened the situation, requiring delivery of non-essential items, prioritizing evacuation of officers, and interfering with logistics. Göring misled Hitler, exaggerating success and hiding failure. Inside the pocket, conditions became catastrophic. Soldiers starved, ammunition ran out, wounded died untreated. General Arthur Schmidt reported that the army was collapsing from lack of supply. By January, Soviet offensives intensified, further increasing supply needs. Airfields were lost one by one. Gumrack, the last usable airfield, fell in late January, ending the airlift entirely. The final statistics were devastating. Over 400 transport aircraft lost. Average deliveries far below requirements. The Sixth Army destroyed. The Luftwaffe lost nearly half its transport fleet and over 3,000 aircrew. The loss crippled future operations. The psychological toll on aircrews was immense. They described missions as suicide operations for a promise everyone knew could not be kept. Post-war analysis concluded the airlift had been impossible from the beginning. Göring had either failed to understand or chosen to ignore reality. The moment Göring realized failure cannot be precisely identified because he resisted that realization until it became undeniable. Even after the war, he refused to accept responsibility. The failure destroyed his standing with Hitler and marked the end of his influence. The Stalingrad airlift became a symbol of the gap between Nazi promises and military reality. Göring learned the truth only when it was too late, when the Sixth Army had already paid the price for his promise.
The cold morning of November 24, 1942, found Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring in his lavish hunting lodge at Rominten in East Prussia, far from the desperate crisis unfolding on the Volga River. The commander of the Luftwaffe received the telephone call that would define his role in Germany's greatest military catastrophe with the casual confidence of a man who had never encountered a problem that promises and bluster could not solve. The message was stark. Soviet forces had completed the encirclement of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Field Marshal Paulus requested permission to break out. Hitler demanded that the pocket be held, and the question facing the Luftwaffe was whether aerial resupply could sustain nearly 300,000 men through a Russian winter. Göring's response, delivered without hesitation or detailed analysis, would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The Luftwaffe could supply Stalingrad by air. The promise was made before calculations were completed, before logistics officers were consulted, before the stark reality of what was being promised was fully understood. The background to Göring's promise lay in the Reichsmarshal's desperate need to restore his standing with Hitler after years of declining influence. The Luftwaffe's failures in the Battle of Britain, its inability to prevent British bombing of German cities, and its losses on the Eastern Front had all eroded Göring's position as Hitler's most trusted deputy. The opportunity to claim that the Luftwaffe could solve Stalingrad crisis, could enable Hitler to refuse Paulus's request to break out, and could demonstrate that air power remained decisive, was too tempting for Göring to resist. The promise was made from political calculation more than from operational analysis, from a desire to please Hitler rather than from a realistic assessment of capabilities. The initial reaction among Luftwaffe staff officers to Göring's promise ranged from shock to despair. The logistics specialists who understood the mathematics of aerial resupply knew immediately that the promise could not be kept. General Hans Jeschonnek, chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, attempted to explain to Göring that the Sixth Army required a minimum of 500 tons of supplies daily, that the Luftwaffe lacked sufficient transport aircraft to deliver such tonnages, and that Soviet air defenses and winter weather would inflict losses that would quickly deplete available aircraft. Göring dismissed Jeschonnek's concerns with assurances that the Luftwaffe had accomplished difficult missions before and would do so again, that doubts were evidence of defeatism, and that the Führer had been promised success, and success would be delivered. General Martin Fiebig, commanding 8th Air Corps, responsible for executing the airlift, calculated the requirements and capabilities with precision that made the impossibility of the mission undeniable. Fiebig's staff determined that the Sixth Army needed a minimum of 300 tons daily to survive without conducting offensive operations, and closer to 500 tons if it was to maintain combat effectiveness. The transport fleet available consisted primarily of Junkers Ju-52 aircraft that could carry approximately 2 tons each under ideal conditions. This meant that even delivering the minimum required tonnage would require 150 aircraft flying missions daily, every day, without losses, mechanical failures, or weather delays. The arithmetic was brutal and unforgiving. The mission was impossible with the resources available. The detailed analysis that Fiebig prepared for Göring documented not just the tonnage requirements, but all the factors that would prevent their achievement. The airfields available near Stalingrad lacked the capacity to handle the volume of traffic that the mission required. The maintenance facilities at those airfields were inadequate to keep transport aircraft operational in winter conditions. The crews who would fly the missions were exhausted from months of continuous operations. The Soviet air defenses around Stalingrad were formidable and improving daily. Winter weather would frequently prevent flying altogether. Each factor multiplied the difficulty of a mission that was already impossible. Göring's response to Fiebig's analysis revealed the Reichsmarshal's complete disconnection from operational realities. Göring insisted that the calculations were too pessimistic, that Luftwaffe crews would overcome obstacles through determination, that Soviet air defenses could be suppressed, and that weather forecasting would allow missions to be planned around storms. The response reflected not a reasoned rebuttal, but a refusal to acknowledge that the promise made to Hitler could not be kept. The initial week of airlift operations in late November and early December provided immediate evidence that Fiebig's pessimistic calculations had actually been optimistic. The daily tonnages delivered averaged less than 100 tons, far below the 300-ton minimum required. Weather prevented flying on many days. Soviet fighters shot down aircraft that had expected to operate without serious opposition. The airfields in the pocket came under Soviet artillery fire, making landing and unloading increasingly dangerous. Losses in aircraft and crews mounted at rates that could not be sustained. The operational challenges that transport crews faced exceeded anything that peacetime training or previous missions had prepared them for. Flights into Stalingrad required navigating through Soviet air defenses that grew stronger daily, flying through winter weather ranging from fog to blizzards, and landing at airfields under artillery bombardment. Colonel Fritz Morzik, appointed to coordinate the airlift operations, attempted to organize the chaos through systematic planning that reality quickly undermined. Morzik established schedules for departures, routes, and landings, but these schedules assumed aircraft availability, predictable weather, and manageable enemy interference. All these assumptions proved false. The operation descended into desperate improvisation within days.